What we're going to be talking next now is the key concepts in SCM. So what are the key concepts in SCM analysis? So the first key concept that we have are latent and observed variables. So I've already given a hint of some of what latent and observed variable is earlier on. So what are latent and observed variables? So first of all, we need to know that observed variables are measured directly. So these are variables which you can measure in real sense in real life. So a typical example of an observed variable can be weight of a person. So we know that weight of an individual comes in kilogram or in any other units depending on the particular location of that particular individual. So observed variables can be measured directly, and they also have a unit of measurement. Let's just put it like that. Is a unit of measuring and observed variables. They also have latent variables which are not what cannot be observed or directly measured. So these latent variables have to be derived from observed variables. Now let's give an example now. Imagine happiness now. How can you know an individual is happy? If you want to analyze happiness now, maybe with other variables, how do you know an individual is happy? There's no way of measuring happiness. We cannot say it's okay. Somebody says is 7% happy or 6%, something like that. We don't have no unit of measuring happiness. So this is where latent variables come in place. That actually variables cannot be measured directly, but instead can be inferred from observed variables. So we know we cannot measure happiness directly, but we have some variables which we know they can give us a sense of how an individual is happy. Such as, for example, now such variable can be a person's income. Now let's just say those that are having higher paycheck now are likely to be happy than those that are not having higher paycheck. So but we know we have a way of measuring someone's income. We already know that it's receiving a particular salary every year. So you can have a record of that individual salary. I know that, okay, we can use this to get someone's happiness. We also have a person, maybe a relationship status. Is the person single or married? You can know that maybe those in relationship are actually happy or more happy than those who are not in relationship. So this can be a general case or depending from location to location. So we can use these two information to have an idea of what someone's happiness is. So that means in this situation now, our observed variables can be the income and the relationship status, while our latent variable can now be happiness. So latent variables are also known as latent constructs. So you can either call them latent variables or latent constructs, anyone you want or you're interested in. So this is a diagram now which you can see of what I've explained earlier on. You can see happiness. So you can see happiness now. This is happiness, and you can see our marital status. So this is our marital status. Then we also have our income. You can see that our two observed variables now, income and marital status. I can now see our latent variable called happiness. So the reason why, I know you might be wondering, why is it that these arrows are pointing down and not up? So instead of these arrows to be pointing down, why are they not pointing up like this? So why is it that they are not pointing up like this? So this diagram that you're looking at now, you can see that we are having our variables. You can see our latent variable now, which is happiness. I can also see our two observed variables, which is income and marital status. So now I can now see that happiness, the arrows is flowing from the happiness to the two observed variables, which is income and marital status. So you'll be wondering why the arrow is flowing downwards instead of the arrow to be flowing upward. So something like this. Why are we having a downward arrow facing it down instead of upwards? So the thing is that these latent variables are actually what is causing these two variables. So what we mean by causing these two variables is that if not for this latent variable, we're not going to be having these two particular variables in this model. Imagine we have another variable called depression, and we don't want to use these two variables. So these variables are not going to be present inside this particular model. But because of the fact that we have this variable called happiness, that is why we're having this income and marital status. So happiness is actually influencing the observed variables, even though these observed variables are used in deriving something for the latent variable, or they're used in observing the latent variable. The latent variable is still influencing the observed variables. That is why these particular arrows are flowing down. So the next now is also path diagrams and notations. So what do we mean by path diagrams and notation? So path diagram, the diagram you actually see earlier on is just a simple, is an example of a simple path diagram. So path diagram actually graphical representation of the relationship between variables in SCM model. So now we have various variables in SCM model, let's say like 20. So a grammatical representation of these variables and the relationship between them is what is called a path diagram. So, and observed variables are usually represented by squares. So just like you saw earlier on, observed variables are represented by squares or rectangles, while latent variables are represented by circles or ovals. So latent variables are usually represented by circles or ovals to indicate that, okay, this is a latent variable, while if you see a square or rectangle, you know that this is an observed variable. And also the arrows between variables represents hypothesized relationship between them, either direct or bidirectional. So relationship can either be direct or bidirectional. So looking at this example now, you can see our latent variable is oval. You can also see our observed variables are what? Squares. And you can see the arrows signifying the relationship between these variables. You can see that latent variable is influencing the observed variables. And now, what do we mean by a direct relationship? A direct relationship is actually between happiness and income, or you can say bidirectional, whereby a single variable is influencing two variables. So a latent variable can actually influence a single observed variables or influence even more than that variable. So which means if it's a single observed variable, that relationship it is direct, while if it is a multiple observed variables, we're gonna call it bidirectional. So now we have endogenous and also exogenous variables. So endogenous variables are variables that are hypothesized to be caused by other variables in the model. So any variable that is causing another variable is known as an endogenous variable in the model, while exogenous variables are variables that are not influenced by other variables in the model. So a typical example now, if you go to our path diagram, you can see that endogenous variables usually have arrows pointing to them, while exogenous variables don't. So now look at this particular path diagram we have in now. You can see our endogenous variable is actually our latent variable. Why our exogenous variables is the latent variable happiness, while our endogenous variables are income and marital status. So you can see that happiness is influencing these two variables. So no arrows is pointing to happiness. So this is why it is called an exogenous variable. It is not influenced by any other variables in the model. But income and marital status are influenced by happiness, and they have arrows pointing to them. That is why they are known as income. That is why they are known as endogenous variables. But one thing I want you to know is that endogenous and exogenous variables can either be latent or observed variables. So we cannot say exogenous variables is only peculiar to latent variables. An observed variable can actually be exogenous variables, while a latent variable can also be an endogenous variable. It just depends on how the theory of the model looks like, or how the hypothesized model looks like. Sometimes you can just have arrows pointing. You can even have arrows sometimes that are pointing to another. Let's say you can have arrows that is pointing from this latent variable to also another variable, which means that happiness might be influencing another latent variable. So this is a possibility. So which means your new latent variable which will be having where happiness is influencing it is also called an endogenous variable. So you can see where a latent variable now is called an exogenous variable. So for example, now I can have my arrow like this now pointing to another latent variable. You can see it here. So let's say now this latent variable now can be let's say for example now, let's say happiness is influencing. So let's just use just an example. You can just say happiness is influencing laughter. So you can see laughter. So happiness now, you can see that happiness is influencing laughter. Just an example. So in this situation now, this one has become an what? Endogenous variable. So you can see it now because it is having what? It is being caused by another variable, even though it is a latent variable. And also on its own, it can also be influencing other observed variables. So this is one thing I want you to know. On its own, it can also be influencing other observed variables which we can have, even though it is also influenced by a latent variable. So which means now you can see that this latent variable has already become an endogenous variables, regardless of it being a latent variable. So these are situations whereby a latent variables can also be an endogenous variables. But you can see happiness now is having no arrows. That is no arrows to it. That is why it is an exogenous variable in this example. So this is the difference between endogenous and exogenous variables. And also, just a recap, a latent variable and observed variable can also be endogenous or exogenous depending on the hypothesized relationship. So now we have direct and indirect effect. So what do we know as a direct effect? So direct effect is the direct relationship between two variables. So a relationship whereby a variable is pointing to another variable is known as a direct relationship. But whereby you have another variable coming in between them, we call this a mediator. So it is mediating between two variables. One variable is predicting another variable or influencing another variable, and we have another variable coming in between. Then that variable is known as a mediator. So that mediator is now mediating the relationship between these two variables. Then we now say the relationship between that variable and the other variables is known as an indirect effect. So look at this example now. You can see that happiness. So you can see now that what? Happiness is directly influencing marital status. So you can see that happiness is directly influencing marital status. So this is an example of a direct effect. But whereby happiness is influencing occupation with a mediator known as income coming in between. So now what we mean by this is that now we know that happiness influences income. So which means that what? A person's happiness can be determined from his income. And also know a person's income can also be determined from his what? Occupation. So you can now see that how the arrow is going from happiness to income, then to occupation, with a mediator present in between these two variables. So this is known as an indirect effect between happiness and occupation.